Whereabouts of Wagner mercenary boss Yevgeny Prigozhin are unknown, following a deal reportedly struck by Belarus for him to leave Russia. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says that the rebellion by the Wagner mercenary group in Russia exposed cracks in President Putin's authority.
Prigozhin himself saying that Ukraine and NATO did not pose a threat to Russia, which is, as you know, been part of Putin's narrative. These create more cracks in the Russian facade.
And BBC's exclusive start tonight in Russia, where many questions remain unanswered a day after the Wagner chief, Yevgeny Prigozhin, abandoned his short-lived rebellion against the Kremlin. Currently, the whereabouts of both Prigozhin and Russian President Vladimir Putin are unknown. The Wagner chief was thought to be heading into exile in Belarus after agreeing to end his advance on Moscow. Well, the rebellion and subsequent retreat surprised many. It's being seen as the most serious challenge to President Putin's grip on power in over 20 years. And speaking about the events earlier, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that the revolt had laid bare real cracks in Mr. Putin's authority.
I think we're in the midst of a moving picture. We haven't seen the last act. We're watching it very closely and carefully. But just step back for a second and put this in context. 16 months ago, Russian forces were on the doorstep of Kyiv in Ukraine, thinking they'd take the city in a matter of days, thinking they would erase Ukraine from the map as an independent country. Now, over this weekend, they've had to defend Moscow, Russia's capital, against mercenaries of Putin's own making. Prigozhin himself, in this entire incident, has raised profound questions about the very premises for Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the first place, saying that Ukraine or NATO did not pose a threat to Russia, which is part of Putin's narrative, and it was a direct challenge to Putin's authority. So this raises profound questions. It shows real cracks. We can't speculate or know exactly where that's going to go. We do know that Putin has a lot more to answer for in the weeks and months ahead.
While President Putin faces uncertainty, so too does the Wagner Group. It is unclear what will happen next to Prigozhin and his ranks of mercenary soldiers who have been key in Russia's war on Ukraine. Here's the BBC's Steve Rosenberg in Moscow.
Leaving as heroes. The Wagner fighters pulling out of Rostov last night. You'd think they'd just won a war. The leader of the mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, was off too. He'd just done a deal with the Kremlin to end their mutiny. The rebellion started here, then spread north. It was the biggest challenge to Vladimir Putin's authority since he came to power.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
Russia's commander-in-chief likes to project an image of strength. A mutiny on his watch is embarrassing. But is it damaging? For Vladimir Putin, will there be political fallout ahead of next year's election?
He definitely looks weaker. All elite groups will begin to think about the presidency 2024. Should they rely, as they did even 1 week before this military coup, on Vladimir Putin? Or should they think about someone new?
But there's no sign yet that someone new in the Kremlin is Mr. Putin's plan.
Vladimir Putin is determined to show that he is in charge, in control in the Kremlin. And he has the Russian state media to help him paint that picture. Trouble is, the dramatic events of the last couple of days have raised questions about how in control the Russian authorities are of the situation here.
Instability. Russians can feel it. The rebel Wagner fighters may not have made it to Moscow, but people here were watching nervously and waiting. I'm a mother with 3 children, Anna tells me. Of course I'm terrified by what has happened. We were scared these events would spread to Moscow, Nastya says. There's nothing ordinary citizens can do to influence the situation. It's decided above our heads. Many Russians tell me that. They don't believe they have the power to change what is happening in their country, to make their voices heard, to turn things around. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
Well, as Steve Rosenberg reports, the past 48 hours call into question just how firm Vladimir Putin's grip on Russia actually is. For now, at least, his main opponents are in exile or in prison. So what happens next? Well, Bill Browder is an anti-corruption activist, author and Putin critic, and I spoke with him a little earlier. Bill, welcome to the programme. After a startling 24 hours in Russia, what do you think comes next for President Putin?
Well, Putin comes out of this whole mess looking much weaker than he did going into it 48 hours ago. And that's a real problem for him. That kind of weakness will attract other people to have a go at him, to challenge his authority, and to potentially try to do the same thing. And so from Putin's perspective, he needs to be what I call the meanest guy in the prison yard. He needs to show his teeth. He needs to show that he could be more brutal than anyone else. And so what that means is he's going to start rounding up anybody who he thought is disloyal, anyone who isn't completely on his side, and those people will end up either in jail or dead. There's going to be a purge in Russia that would make Stalin blush. And that's the only way that Putin can reassert his authority and exit this risky moment that he's in, where other people will try the same thing.
But Bill, do you think ultimately that he can survive this?
I think that this is the beginning of the end for Putin. But how long that end process takes, I couldn't predict. I think that it's truly a game changer, because everybody thought he's a killer guy, that people support him. But these troops of Prigozhin's rolled into Rostov without any type of opposition. They didn't even have to fire a single shot. They then rolled into Voronezh, same thing. They were cheered. And what this suggests is that Putin is not popular, that people were actually rooting for the other guys. And that's a really damning realization for Russia, for the Russian people, for everybody to look around them and say, well, actually, everybody shares my view, which is that this guy's not doing us any good. And that's going to be a hard thing to recover from, and maybe an impossible thing to recover from.
And what about Prigozhin? Do you think that he will go quietly to Belarus, or do you think that he could try to challenge Putin again?
Well, I think that he's still a very integral part of the whole Russian system. Now, remember that he was a guy who was doing all the hacking of the U.S. elections using his Internet Research Agency. He's a guy who's running all sorts of mercenary operations in Africa for different African leaders, which is effectively Russia's foreign policy in Africa. And he's a person who was integrally involved in the whole invasion of Ukraine. I think that he's probably too important a person to disappear. And what he did was unforgivable, but at the same time, if they got rid of him, they don't have anyone else like him. In fact, his Wagner mercenary group was the only fighting group that the Ukrainians had any respect for. Everyone else in the regular Russian military, the Ukrainians laugh at as they kill them. And so I think that we're a long way from seeing Prigozhin just to quietly disappear into the sunset. I don't think that's going to happen in any way, shape, or form. Now, how does he behave towards Putin? That's another question, but I'm sure he's going to remain an important player in Russia.
And what about further opposition? I just wonder, Bill, if watching the latest developments, could opposition to Putin's rule essentially be emboldened now from other quarters? And if so, what could that mean?
I think there's absolutely going to be emboldened. Anybody who disliked Putin, and there's many people that do, is going to say, wow, the king's not wearing any clothes. Let's think of our plan. Let's come up with something. And so at the end of the day, those opportunities for those people will very much depend on how ruthless Putin becomes in his crackdown. And we're going to see a crackdown like we've never seen before in Russia, and how effective that crackdown is, and how scary it is for regular people who don't like Putin will determine how much opposition comes and how many other people decide to have a go at him.
Well, tell us more about how you envisage a potential crackdown, because these events, they will not have gone unnoticed by the Russian people. What do you think that this could mean for them?
I think we're going to see many, many people arrested, many people government officials, military officials, oligarchs, anybody who Putin thinks is not 100% supportive of him, 100% loyal, will find themselves in jail or killed. And Putin will make a public display of this in order to demonstrate to everybody in Russia that there's only there's either the choice of death or prison on one side or total loyalty on the other side. And he has to do that as a dictator in order to stay in power.
And what do you think this could potentially mean on the battlefield then? What could this mean for Ukraine?
It's great news for Ukraine. First of all, the Wagner private military company was the only really effective fighting force against the Ukrainians. They no longer exist. And many of those people will disperse. The ones that join the regular ranks are going to be led by inferior officers. So Wagner disappears. And then you have this other problem, which is Russia has now witnessed how weak their defenses are in all cities like Rostov and Voronezh and all the places that Wagner was. And so Russia is going to have to devote military resources to reinforcing their own internal security. And that means less people on the front in Ukraine, less resources in Ukraine. And thirdly, what this shows is that the more that Ukraine has success, the more people fight with each other in Russia. And so I think that all these things really play into Ukraine's hands in their counteroffensive. And I think this is excellent news for Ukraine.
And Bill, with all of that in mind, how do you think other countries right now are viewing President Putin?
I think everyone around the world is looking at him as a weak leader, as somebody much less in control than we thought before, much less powerful, much less vicious than we saw before. And that weakness will cause him all sorts of troubles, both internationally and domestically. It's a total disaster for Putin. This last 48 hours is really the worst thing that I've ever seen happen to him in 23 years since he's been in power.
Bill Browder, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky discussed this weekend's turmoil in Russia in phone calls with US President Biden, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, and Poland's President Duda. The trio of leaders affirmed their continued support for Ukraine and discussed the situation in Russia. Now, in a statement, President Zelensky called for global pressure to be exerted on Russia and said that he and President Biden had also discussed further expanding defense cooperation with an emphasis on long-range weapons.
We have, of course, talked about the fighting on the front line and our active movements. I have thanked the partners for their support. It is really crucial and helps our fighters to move forward. The Russian occupants are suffering heavy casualties, and we need that. The longer the Russian aggression continues, the more degradation it causes in Russia itself. One of the examples of such degradation is that the Russian aggression is now coming home.